When you're staring at a stack of museum-grade mats and wondering whether the cutter on your bench will actually give you clean, repeatable cuts, the decision can feel surprisingly risky. It's the kind of gear that sits in the shop for years, so you want to be sure you're not throwing money at something that will either jam on a thick 8-ply board or leave a ragged edge on a delicate 4-ply piece. I'm going to walk through the real-world experience of the Logan Graphics 850 Platinum Edge Mat Cutter, pointing out where it saves you time, where it might bite you, and who should really consider putting this on their workbench. Link is in the description if you want to check the product details on Amazon. First off, the biggest question most hobbyists and small studio framers ask is whether a professional cutter is overkill for their volume. The 850 is marketed as Logan's top-level heavy-duty cutter, and that claim holds up when you look at the design intent. The machine is built around a 40-inch, about 101 centimeters, cutting rail that can accommodate both 4-ply and 8-ply mat boards without needing a separate accessory. In my own setup, that means I can lay a full-size 11-14 mat board flat, align the cut line with the built-in guide, and pull the blade through in a single, fluid motion. The micro-adjustable moving magnetic stop is the part that really matters when you're trying to keep your cuts consistent from board to board. I spend a few minutes calibrating it on the first use, and once the magnetic stop clicks into place, the distance stays put even when you tap the rail hard. That steadiness translates directly into less waste, no more recutting a mat, because the previous slice was a millimeter short. The cutting action itself is where this super smooth claim is put to the test. Logan uses a dedicated replacement blade, Model 267, that slides into a holder with a simple latch. The blade is thin enough to glide through a 4-ply board without pulling, yet robust enough that I didn't have to stop and sharpen after a dozen cuts on 8-ply stock. In real use, the cut edge feels clean enough that I can skip the final sanding step that many lower-priced cutters force you to do. If you're someone who does a lot of custom framing for galleries or high-end clients, that little time saver adds up quickly. Now, let's talk about the trade-offs that aren't on the spec sheet. The cutter's base is removable for transport, which is handy if you move between a studio and a client's site. But the removal mechanism isn't as intuitive as you might hope. You have to loosen a couple of wing nuts, then slide the entire 40-inch rail out. The process takes a minute or two, and if you're in a hurry, you might forget to lock the wing nuts back before you start cutting something that can cause the rail to shift under pressure. It's a small inconvenience, but it's worth noting if you plan on using the cutter in a cramped space or swapping it between rooms often. Another practical consideration is the price point. The 850 sits in the upper mid-range for mat cutters, competing with models like the Matmaster Pro and the Artistic FrameMate. While Logan's reputation for durability is solid, the cost can feel steep for a solo framist who only does a handful of projects a month. The real value comes from the blade's longevity and the reduced material waste, so if your average job involves cutting multiple large format mats, the investment starts to make sense. However, if you're a hobbyist who rarely works with 8-ply boards, you might find a more modest 30-inch cutter does the job just fine. Who should buy it? If you run a professional framing shop, an art gallery, or a design studio where consistency and speed are part of your service promise, the 850's heavy-duty rail and magnetic stop can pay for themselves in reduced rework. The ability to handle both 4-ply and 8-ply without swapping tools means you can keep the workflow flowing, especially during peak order periods. The cutter also shines for anyone who needs to produce a high volume of identical cuts. Think a batch of exhibition mats where each piece must be a mirror image of the next. In those scenarios, the micro-adjustable stop becomes a precision ruler that you trust day after day. On the flip side, if you're a casual crafter, a home-based hobbyist, or someone who only occasionally needs to mat a piece for personal display, the 850 might be more than you need. A smaller, less expensive cutter can handle occasional 4-ply work without the heavy rail, and the learning curve for the magnetic stop isn't always worth the time investment when you're only making a handful of cuts a year. Also, keep in mind that the cutter doesn't come with a built-in dust collection system. In a small studio without good ventilation, you'll need to add a separate shop vac or work outdoors to keep the fine matte dust from settling on your work surface. A practical weakness that showed up during my testing was